Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on Smart Manufacturing Market with Industry 4.0 Technologies. I'm Sally from MyScienceWork, and during this webinar, we'll explore the impact of COVID-19 on economic activity, understand the main technologies of the Industry 4.0 paradigm, and more importantly, its application as a response strategy to the ongoing pandemic. And recent accelerated transition to digitalization, that's something we will explore during the course of this webinar, and also its application to not just the pandemic control, but also future global economic activities. So basically understanding how companies are planning for future operations. Together, we also aim to provide you with an overview of these insights, as well as the solutions to support this crucial digital transformation. So joining me today are researcher Nicola Melluso, economist, and Professor Piergiuseppe Fortunato Ph.D, as he would like to be called, and scientist and research director Mika Salmi. So let me start by giving you a proper introduction to our panelists. Nicola is conducting research in data science for business and industry at the University of Pisa. So his principal topics of interests include natural language processing, product design, innovation management, to name a few. And he has developed text mining tools to assess workers' hard and soft skills and to detect technological convergence. We also have today economist and Professor Pepe. He is currently an economist at the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. And before joining UNCTAD, he was an economist at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations. In the past, he held a position of assistant professor in economics at the University of Bologna and was a research fellow at Sorbonne. His research interests include political economics, economic development, international trade, and South-South integration. In these fields, he has published in journals like the Journal of Economic Growth, the Economic Journal, the European Economic Review. He's also heavily involved in policy-oriented research. He edited a volume on post-conflict recovery on Bloomsbury Academic, published policy journals like Global Policy, and contributes to several blogs. Also joining today is Mika Salmi. Mika is the research director for Aalto University in Finland, so in Digital Design Laboratory. He has a combined 15 years of research experience in industrial and medical applications of additive manufacturing. Mika also specializes in digital manufacturing and 3D modeling, amongst others. So that being said, and before we start, I'm going to briefly run you through some housekeeping for those of you who are joining us live. You will see a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, or maybe the bottom right hand of your screen. So I invite you to enter your questions, as you think of them during the webinar by typing them into the box. Answers will not be displayed. Instead, towards the end of the webinar, around the 45 mark, we'll answer some questions that we have come in. So please don't miss out on this opportunity. We'll aim to reach all your questions. So back to today's subject matter. Well, this year has been a challenge for obvious reasons. And the economy is taking a bad fall here. So joining us from Geneva, Pepe is going to talk all about it. Hello, Pepe. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Sally. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So tell us, Pepe, to what extent, in your opinion, has the pandemic affected global economic activity since 2020?
Yes, quite an interesting and vast question. I'll try to be concise as I can. Let me take this, but let me start taking this from a more of an historical perspective, which I think can help to make having an idea and a clear idea on what's going on. 10 years ago, let me start from 10 years ago, the world's major economies were harmed by what we all know as the global financial crisis, which was probably the most important financial crisis after the one that did the economies in the 30s. In that occasion, the leaders of the G20 gathered in London. It was early April 2009, and agreed on a bold plan on action to try to strike back against the regression and the recession. And the idea was to restore confidence, growth and jobs, to repair the financial system that was harmed, and to introduce new financial regulation to recreate trust in the system. What was sucked out from the system, from the global economy, was mostly trust for the subprime crisis and what all that followed. All of this, at the end of the day, didn't happen. This plan didn't materialize. And that was because both Europe and the United States turned pretty sudden the year after, actually from 2010, toward what was called a structural reform and austerity policies. Under the false premises somehow that regulation and growth of public sector would have restrained future growth. So there was a plan that was completely disattended. What was the result of all of that was the economic situation that we've been living in the last 10 years, which was basically a self-reinforcing cycle of weak aggregate demand, very tepid economic growth, even in the year which were most rosy in a sense, and widening inequality, which is the overwhelming characteristic of the last decade, what's happened right before and soon after the financial crisis. Now, this was the relatively fragile state of the world, of the global economy, where a microscopic pathogen rapidly made its way around the world at the end of the year, what we now called as COVID-19. And already in March 2020, with COVID-19 contagion becoming a full-blown pandemic and the death toll rising, governments across the world opted for what we can define as a policy-induced economic coma. We decided to stop all the economic activity, to cut in a dramatic way interpersonal relations with the objective to prevent infections and to relieve the overburdened health system. This is what the IMF called Great Lockdown, the most important lockdown in economic history. Even at the times of the Spanish flu, there was nothing compared in terms of dimension and length as what we've been living till now, in a sense. Of course, this kind of policy-induced economic coma, this great lockdown, what it did is tip the global economy into recession, and in fact, into a global recession, which we will live in 2020, which has no comparison. Probably the only possible comparison is the 1930s financial crisis, which hit the United States, Great Depression. And in fact, just to give you some data, we just launched our trade and development report on the 22nd, a couple of days ago, with some forecast. And what we forecast in our report, and is relatively optimistic with respect to the forecast of the other organizations, so that's just to give you an idea of how bad can be this year, the world economy will contract by over 4%, leaving a shortfall in global output by the end of the year, no less than $6 trillion. And of course, as domestic activity contracts sharply almost in all the world, the same will happen to international economy. The trade will shrink by around 1/5, by 20%. Foreign direct investment will go down by 40%, while remittances will drop by over 100 billion. This is very worrisome because remittances are particularly important for the economies of least developing countries, which are the ones which were suffering before and will suffer even more after the crisis. Now, what's going to happen on the production side, on the supply side? Well, the containment policies to fight the virus basically stopped many non-essential activities. And the impact was overwhelmingly negative on services, especially in hospitality, entertainment, travel, and tourism. Air companies basically stopped their activity for over a couple of months. Planes were not flying on the world, people were not traveling. And since many of these services, like travel and tourism is an example, for many of these services, temporary reduction in demand does not necessarily create a compensating spike after the isolation. Usually when you have a recession, you have stop of consumption for a period, but then you have a quick recovery because after the crisis hit the economy, then everybody's going to do what they didn't do before. Okay, so buying a car or taking an haircut. For some services like tourism, like travelers, this is not the case. So this service recession will mean a permanent loss of income and on jobs for many workers. And the effects on the industry, in a sense, were less intense than for services, but still the lockdowns are very strong in many sectors, especially the consumer durables, so cars, bikes, and so on and so forth. What is the impact of all of that in terms of employment? We are all interested about also the social fallouts of the economic problems. Well, the overall employment impact this year from the combination of the lockdown and the temporary relief policies which have been implemented is still kind of difficult to gauge. But the ILO estimates that more than 500 million jobs worldwide have been put in jeopardy because of the crisis. And while many of these jobs will return after the end of the crisis, according to the same estimation of the ILO, over 100 million jobs will be permanently lost at world level, which is enormously worrisome, of course. Now, last part of my reply, we've seen the overall situation of the economy, the focus on the supply side, on the production is about the financial markets. And as it is always the case when perception of risk increases, and this is one of these cases, of course, what we witnessed is what we call a flight to safety. Okay, so investors, what they're doing is taking out their money from risky assets and are putting there where they think things are safer. They cannot put under the pillow, but you can buy government bonds, for example. And actually, what we have been observing, which is particularly interesting, is that in this case, the flight to safety predated the diffusion of the virus in many developing countries. In the country of the south of the world, the virus arrived this spring, late spring and in the summer, but the flight to safety started actually after the virus affected China, already in January, February 2020. What's happened in particular is investors fled risky assets for government bonds, as I was saying, and in particular government bonds of advanced economies, US Federal Reserve bonds or EU bonds. And these, at the end of the day, was pushing the equity markets down and the risk premiums up for both the government's bonds in developing country, so the sovereign debts of developing country, and corporate debt bonds in both advanced and emerging markets. So that was a massive blast for public sector in developing country and for the private sector, both in advanced and developing economies. And in turn, these had two major and pernicious kind of consequences. On the one hand, the dramatic increase in financial constraints faced by the private sector because banks were raising their lending standards and interest rate spreads because they were scary about possible increase in delinquency rate on the loans. And on the other hand, the deterioration of the debt situation in many developing economies whose situation was already precarious before the COVID and now have been de facto tipped into the brink of default.
So clearly that's not looking good. Is there an underlying explanation behind this? Sorry.
I cannot hear you.
Do you hear me now? It's okay? You can hear me? Okay.
I cannot hear you. I don't know why.
Let me reinsert my microphone. Is that better?
I don't know if it is my ears.
Perhaps maybe you can put it on speaker mode.
Yes, better.
Yeah?
Yes.
All right, great.
The problem was my technical problem with my earphones. Now better.
Happens to the best of us. Pepe, I mean, clearly it's not looking good from an economic standpoint and a financial standpoint. I would like to know, is there really an underlying explanation behind this magnitude of economic disruption? Is there what is the problem? What is the underlying problem? Is it a fragile model?
Well, it's as I mentioned before, by the early 2020, the global economy had grown already fragile. Over the 3 decades, why? In part because of the policy choices taken after the global financial crisis, but also because of the last 3 decades, basically from the beginning of the 80s, there have been implemented in all the advanced countries, especially in the Western part of the world, deregulation policies on the financial sector, which became grown bigger and bigger and bigger, but this is not the problem per se. The problem is that they became much more independent from the real economy. So there was a disconnection between the financial economy and the real economy, which contributed to generate inequality and to rise up and spice up the level of debt. But advanced economy, I'm Italian, and Italy is one of the countries in the advanced world which is suffering a lot from sovereign debt problem, but in particular in developing the economy. And the evidence is astonishing in this direction. So the increasing inequality and the debt levels, and in a way, self-explanatory. The labor income share, for example, has displayed a downward trend in many economies, both in developed and developing, as I was telling you before, since the early 80s, with a corresponding rise in profit share. So labor share was going down and profit share were going up. And what is worse, the labor income dynamics diverge from the labor productivity. That is, labor productivity was increasing much more than labor income were doing, that wages were doing.
Right.
The proximate cause behind these trends has been the wage repression, which was due in particular to the weakening of labor market institutions almost everywhere. Weakening of labor market institutions, which have prevented wage from keeping pace with increases in productivity, and in many cases, even with increasing the cost of living. That is, in many countries, the south of Italy is an example in the advanced world, cost of living was increasing more than the wages.
Right.
So it basically entail a deterioration in the actual condition of living. At the same time, the debt level as I was telling you, soared. According to the Institute of International Finance, in the first quarter of 2020, the global debt stock had reached the record level of 258 trillion, which is an enormous number. 10 years ago, this would have been even not thinkable, this kind of dimension. In developed economies, the problem is mostly due to fast rising corporate debt, which is of increasing deteriorating quality. And while the total indebtedness, and the numbers here are astonishing, the total indebtedness on non-financial corporates amount to around $75 trillion in 2019, which is exactly twice what it was in 2008. So we had a problem with quality of debt and quality of loans, which was at the heart of the financial crisis of 2008. And what we did with our policy reaction in 10 years, we doubled the quantity of that same debts, which is pretty evil kind of way to react to a problem, doubling the size of that debt, which created the problem in the first case. In the developing economies, the situation is different. There is enormous level of debt, but it is not corporate and private debt. Here we have sovereign debt, which is suffering a lot from the spillovers of the global financial instability, because as I told you before, interest rates are going up. Part of this debt in developing economy is denominated in dollars, and this is creating even more problem for this country to serve the debt. So risk of bankruptcy and debt crisis are very high at the moment. Now, why all this matter in the current juncture? Well, at the end of the day, what the debt exposure does is that it dramatically increases the economic vulnerability to a shock. If I have a huge amount of debt and I'm hit by a shock, what's happening is the interest rate goes up, and then the risk of collapsing is much higher with respect to a country with low level of debt. On the other hand, what is the role of inequality? Well, the social fallouts of the shocks are bigger and harder the higher is inequality. The higher is the level of inequality, the higher is the quantity of people which lack social protection in the society. And here basically are the roots of the disruption that we are experiencing, just to link up to your question. Debt levels which have been exploding and inequality which is very high. And this is the result of the policy choices which have been taken since global financial crisis onward at the end of the day. The trends that we have both in depth of inequality since 2007, 2008 are very worrisome. Now, on top of that, and I'm working for the United Nations, so it's part of my work, what we are witnessing, and is under the eyes of everybody, is a multilateral governance which is completely fractured, as it never was since the end of the Second World War. In the last few years, the tariff hikes and other trade reducing policy have heightened tension between the United States and China, as we all know. What was the results of all of this was that the World Trade Organization has been basically cornered into a de facto stalemate, and many economies are now enacting temporary export ban and restriction on critical goods after the COVID-19 outbreak. Mask, ventilator, medical products. That was one of the first pronouncement of the new president of the European Commission for Leiden back in last March. That was the same stance that India, for example, take after the crisis. That was in a world in which nobody trusts the others. The immediate reaction is, in a moment of crisis, we take on our own things, and so we try not to export and not to facilitate the flow out from a country of products which are delicate. And this all the time, of course, when these goods are more needed and were more needed than ever before. At the same time, the inability of the international community to agree on a comprehensive debt standstills and right now, which is in a situation like this, of course, we should move in that direction. What you observe is resistant to the provision of rapid level of liquidity for those countries which are more constrained in terms of enacting social policy, for example, to protect the population in developing economies. These are, in my opinion, important symptoms of a malaise and early warning signs that things could get worse, far worse, if the policy and the political stance does not change. So I think that this evidence, the evidence of the fragility of the system, which make us so vulnerable to a microscopic pathogen affecting us, is a call for action and immediate action right now.
Let me ask this directly from you. Are we experiencing a real supply chain vulnerability here? Or should we brace for some minor shortages to persist? Because the numbers are not looking good to begin with, and it doesn't look very promising as it is. What is your stance on that?
Yes, unfortunately, it is what it is. The numbers are not looking good. The numbers are on the surge once again. In Europe, we are looking the early signs of the second spikes in many
Yep.
countries. And actually, and then there is also the other thing which is very disruptive for global value chain is that the epicenter of the pandemic is moving from region to region. Now it was Asia, then Europe, then it moved to US, now to America, now it seems to be back in Europe. And what is the result of this huge uncertainty is making it extremely difficult to resume business on a global scale, business as usual on a global scale, and managing these supply network which are extending in various countries, because you don't know when the lockdown can hit you, in which part of the work and which part of the value chains you are operating
Sure.
in. So confronting with this growing and increasing uncertainty and long-lasting uncertainty at this point, I would say, and with new norms which affect production cost and unexpected lack of demand, firms are adjusting their business. What multinationals are doing in some cases is reducing or even stalling their activities. Now, once production is discontinued along one chain and one step of the chain, what is happening is that both upstream and downstream activities, that's the whole way in which global value chains work, will suffer from the steam stall of some activities. And these will ultimately lead to value chain destruction and ultimately deprive consumers of essential goods and services. And this is the sort of disruption of value chain you are evocating. You stop some of the stage you have to stop because of a lockdown, but this has dramatic spillover effects on all the chain. And then at the end of the day, we don't produce the product and the value chain is disrupted. So this is something that is happening, it is under our eyes. And furthermore, the health emergency is also generating a sudden rise of demand for certain critical categories of product. No, it's ventilator, mask, around the eyes, everybody.
Yeah.
But what's happening is that the huge uncertainty characterizes the spine on the demand surge. I don't know how long it will last, the need of the world for mask and ventilators, because this is linked, among other things, to research on vaccines, when we will get this magic concept of herd immunity, or to the efficacy of the public health measures that are undertaken. So the idea is that even if there is a surge in demand, in some cases, firms are not increasing the supply, increasing the production, because they don't know how long this increasing demand will rise, and they don't know whether they will be able to return to back to their original level of production, so they would incur enormous cost. And this is most evident in the case of medical devices manufacturers, as I was mentioning before, as testified by the shortage of important products we are all living in. Now, whether these shortages will persist or not will depend once again on the policy and on political choices that we'll undertake. Exogenous shocks alone, be they of technological, climatic, or medical origin, or whatever you can imagine, do not drive social change alone. There is a wonderful book of Louis Simon, which he published last year, and in which he basically makes the points very, very clearly. Choices matter. Social change does not happen because something happened exogenously, but the policy that we choose, the rule that we choose to regulate our society, the decision that we make are extremely important to choose and affect the direction of social and economic change. And for all its discussion of human and economic life, which has been dramatic, and as an Italian we'll be suffering a lot, and as a European we'll be suffering a lot, as in other parts of the world, the novel coronavirus is also creating, in my opinion, an opportunity for lasting change. Big shocks, drama like this also open a window of opportunity. The financial crisis a decade ago, as I was starting my intervention, closing my reply with the same note, in a sense, the financial crisis did the same, opened a window of opportunity, but we did not rise up to the challenge. The international community was not able to exploit that opportunity, as I was discussing during my replies. Now the problems are, if anything, even larger than those that we had 10 years ago, in terms of inequality, in terms of health. You can name the different dimensions. But my impression is that intellectual environment which is developing around these problems, the question that we are trying to ask to ourselves is much more vibrant and much more heterogeneous than it was 10 years ago. And the political will to attack them shows some promising sign of life, listening to our policymakers. So let me close my answer to your question with this note of optimism after some gloomy kind of discussion.
Thank you, Professor. Now that we have dissected the issue at hand and explored all the various the dysfunctional system, before moving on to the application of Industry 4.0 4 technologies and how you see companies planning for operations now and the foreseeable future, at this stage of the webinar, I'd like to redirect the conversation to two technicalities. So the systems and the technology that has been has the capability to support humans in problem solving and decision making. I would like to invite Nicola to join us. Nicola, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Great. So Nicola, my question to you is really, first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So Nicola, could you please break it down to us, the main technologies of the Industry 4.0 paradigm?
Yes, of course. I would like to start the answer to this question by using the definition of Industry 4.0 because sometimes I would like to use a smart approach to answer to your question. If I go on Wikipedia and I will search for Industry 4.0 definition, I will find this statement. Industry 4.0 is the automation of traditional manufacturing practices. This is a really simple statement. If we analyze this statement, it is important to see what are the keywords of this statement. That is, Industry 4.0 is the automation, that is the first keyword, of traditional manufacturing practices. So the two keywords in this case are automation and manufacturing. So why it is called Industry 4.0? Because it is a revolution, and it's a revolution that is applied to the automation of manufacturing. If we look at the other two revolution, and if we search for the definition, it could be the same because it's automation of manufacturing. Okay, what is the difference here? Is that if you look at the definition of Industry 4.0, there's an extension of the definition that says it improves the communication among machines and humans. So this is new because we talk about communication. So what is the technology, or what are the technologies that enable this communication? In this case, we can have the main pillar is the IoT, is the Internet of Things. It's the internet itself that is a technology. So after depicting the definition of Industry 4.0, I can use two approaches to list the technologies that are involved in Industry 4.0. I can use a top-down approach that is the following. The top-down approach lists a list of technologies according to the expertise of some policymakers. So, for example, I am an Italian researcher, so if I go through the Italian law, I can see that there are 9 key enabling technologies. This is, and I would like to list later those nine key enabling technologies. I can use another approach that is like a bottom-up approach that is not boosted by policymakers, by some experts, but it uses like the text. This is what is called text mining. So I can ask to this question by looking inside the scientific production that has been made about Industry 4.0, and I can extract automatically these key enabling technologies. So what is the right answer? The right answer is that the only technology, the only big enabling technology is the digitalization. Right. But I can break down this definition. I would like to use three big fields. Okay, the first I just mentioned the industrial IoT or the IoT itself. What does it mean? It means that a machine has some sensors that can communicate with each other. So a machine as a sensor and another machine as a sensor, and they can communicate each other. So those are two things, and they can communicate without touching them. What happens when these two things communicate? These two things share data. So there's here appears the second enabling technology, that is the data analysis, because those two things communicate each other by sharing some data. And the third comes from the definition of Industry 4.0, that is the automation of production systems. So there will be, for example, the everything that is concerning the blockchain. There will be everything that is concerning the automation for the predictive analysis. There's also, for example, the cybersecurity.
Right.
And then there's the last thing that is the most important. Maybe it is raising a lot during the last years, and it is catching a lot of attention, especially from the community, from the medicine community and others. That is the artificial intelligence. That is like the fuel of all of these enabling technologies of Industry 4.0. That's the reason that's the reason we called now not traditional manufacturing, but we can call them smart manufacturing
Right.
because they have some intelligence inside.
Right. Okay. So that's very insightful. My question, and again, it's in application to the pandemic control, and based on your research, what is your interpretation of the role of the digital and the 4.0 technologies that you just discussed of? What is the link that we can make to their role in the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, Industry 4.0 plays an important role for facing the problems that has been reached with the COVID pandemic, but also the COVID pandemic played an important role and is playing an important role for Industry 4.0. Let me go back to be clear, let me go back to the definition of Industry 4.0. And now we can see how is it possible to change this definition. The definition that is on Wikipedia, so you can go on the webpage of Wikipedia and you can see it. Is Industry 4.0 is the automation of traditional manufacturing practices. After the COVID, the definition could change because it's the digitalization of traditional practices, and it's not concerning only manufacturing.
Right.
Why this is happening? Because before the pandemic, uh, technologists and all of innovators, they saw this smartification and digitalization of things. I can use the term things that with only one purpose, okay? That the purpose was a business purpose, okay? I want to produce more. I want to improve the manufacturing. I want to improve my processes. But during the pandemic, this changed because we saw that these technologies were able not to improve, but were able to help. So let me go back to the example I made with things. Okay, we have two things that communicate each other. So if we think of one of the biggest problem for the pandemic was the social distancing.
Right.
So people cannot be close each other. They can communicate without touching them. without being in the same building, in the same places. So can you see there's a big similarity between things that communicate and machines. And in this case, we have now the person that needs to communicate. Okay, this is you can see how Industry 4.0 is embrace this scenario. So let me always now go back to the key enabling technologies, and I can list some of the technologies that helps fighting, but
Right.
not fighting, but no, I mean they will help fighting, but they will help like fighting the labor, not the COVID itself,
But
but
the risk, right.
yes, to maintain the business scenario. For example, we have, if we think of people working at home using a lot of internet,
Right.
okay, that's the role of cybersecurity. What is the role of cybersecurity? A lot of people uh, were on the computer. We are on the computer, so we have some our personal things, and we want to be secure of them. We want to be secure about our data. Okay, so cybersecurity was invented for industrial purposes, and now is coming really important because we do not only want to protect data, industrial business data, but we want to also protect our data that we are sharing. Okay. Second, I'm talking about data, and this is a really important thing because before the pandemic, we uses data to predict something, okay, to predict looking in the past and to see what is going to happen in the future, but only inside the industrial scenario,
Right.
okay.
Yep.
In this case, we want to predict something that happens also for people moving. And this is the third thing, and people moving, that is really important because if you think of the no touching concept, that's the geolocalization one. So in this case, with the industry 4.0, whose paradigm is communicate without touching. Okay, maybe some technologists can kill me if I say that, but I'm trying to be very clear. The geolocalization was, and it is, a really important technology because helps
Sure.
people to try to trace not themselves, not the activity, but the safety of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so all of this is very interesting in the current context, but I'm also very curious about how you envision industry for technologies contributing to the global industry, but post COVID, how will the labor market be affected? Do you see a radical change that is already taking place that will be accelerated in the very near future? For example, digitalization. How do you envision this?
Yeah, we are witnessing in this case, in this webinar, what happened due to the COVID, because if we are changing the way we work. So is this a boost or not? From my perception, this is a boost because, for example, we are having a conversation, we are having a webinar, so we are having the possibility to communicate and to share some information. So, and this boosted a lot the growth of communication. The information flows goes really faster. So for example, for me or for other attendees to this webinar, it's really easy to reach and to listen to my opinion and to listen to your opinions and to listen to the opinions of the other speakers. So this is a really good I mean, this is a really good spillover. I can call it as a spillover
Right.
of the technology. The information flows goes really, really faster. On the other hand, if we think of another way, another scenario of this webinar, maybe I, I I will join the seminar, the webinar in Paris. So in Paris. So what happened? That I will take the plane and go there and stay in a hotel. So this is something that is changing. So the Industry 4.0 is revolution, and the COVID itself is a revolution. Those are two revolutions that, like every revolutions, they have some bad sides and good sides. Okay.
Sure.
So the information flow and it is the changing of the way people work. For example, the smart working is doing better things.
Yeah.
Okay, because people do not need, because this is boosting not tasks, for example, that are really, really expensive, mind expensive, and also physical expensive. Because I'm trying to improve the way I work without using physical aspects, but I want to be far from the workplace. On the other hand, we have the tourism, and those are the parts of the economy that is changing, of course. The way they are going to change, we don't know. We can learn from the past. We can learn from the past, and the economic scenario it's not the better, as the speaker before me said. But as Professor Fortunato says, we have a choice, and the choice matter. So in this case, we need to choose to invest in those technologies, because they help a lot and they will change the way we work. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Nicola, for that fantastic insights into the industry technologies in theory and in application. I would very quickly like to switch to our third and final guest, Mika Salmi, because Mika will be with us only until 5 p.m. Hello, Mika. Thank you very much for joining us today from all the way from Finland.
Hello, Sally, and thank you for invitation, and good afternoon, or if you're in the different time zones, good morning or good night.
So, Mika, I would like to, you recently published a very, very interesting article about 3D manufacturing, 3D printing in COVID-19, the productivity estimation of the most promising open source solutions in emergency situations. Mika, what are the prevailing challenges of this pandemic?
Yeah, let me share my screen. So if you look about the little bit current challenges, some of this has been already mentioned, but basically, at least in the spring, there was like a really high global need of certain medical stuff. And basically, in those factories for those, they were located in just a couple of countries, and for some supplies, it was that those countries were suffering the mostly of the COVID. So basically, there was the limited manufacturing because some of those factories were closed. But also, we need to maybe think about like availability of the certain parts, products, or even the raw materials was like a challenging. If everyone want the same fabric, or
Right.
or example this plastic sheet for this COVID shields, they were like start running out everywhere. And of course that will lead to high prices, or then very long delivery times and other problems. Then of course there was this export restriction. So someone was producing, but you couldn't export those anywhere because there was a regulations. And also there was a restriction for traveling. So a little bit longer term, example, maintenance of the factories and everything would suffer in that.
Right. So So we already kind of, with Nicola, we kind of addressed a little bit about industry 4 technologies, how it's helping to, resolve certain supply chain gaps and production issues. I would like to ask you, because you specialize in 3D printing and especially 3D manufacturing, I would like to know, based on your expertise, to what extent do you see 3D printing addressing these supply chain gaps and supporting these immediate production needs?
Yeah, if you think about the 3D printing, usually if you order something somewhere, especially something like a common stuff, there is usually like the minimum order quantities.
Right.
So if you need one, you need to order 100. What do you do with the rest of the 99 if you don't have a use for those? Also, the reduction of the delivery time. There can be really long delivery times, even in the normal days in the industry. They can be many months or even years to get the certain parts. Also, if we think about the 3D printing, that also makes possible the local manufacturing. So the manufacturing can happen where the need is, at the closest 3D printing example. And also, if you think about the travel restrictions and export restrictions, so data is too easy to travel. Example, this webinar is a good example of that.
Right.
The physical parts, it's much slower. So there wouldn't be any customs or borders. And also, if you think about the fundamentals of 3D printing, so basically it's like building parts layer by layer. So you use only that material that you need. So it might have a positive environmental impact. And of course, because when you're making parts, you can improve the design for the next part. So basically you can upgrade the parts. Example, like upgraded spare parts. So with the better performance, like you get the software updates at the certain points. Or if you need to get the factory running, you can maybe make some emergency part. So that will run before the actual part comes, but you can make it fast and use it immediately.
Sure.
Or there is possibility to repair some existing components. And if you think about this COVID situation, so here is just a couple of examples what has been 3D printed. So basically, example this nasal swabs that was like a really popular, and there is many models and many methods. Basically, what has been used, and that's used for taking the sample from the nose channel. So that was one example that was 3D printed and used in the situation. Then there was like many of these face masks were 3D printed, but there I would like to say that you still need some kind of fabric in there, which makes and basically the fabric is actually which is making the filtering. That just gives the form. And also this face shields. So those holders were a lot of those holders were 3D printed, and then using like a standard plastics there, or some even like a plastic sheet or something simple to protect the face. But also a little bit more challenging also for the ventilators, some parts were made. Even like a ventilator splitters, so you can use the one ventilator for multiple people. Of course, that has a certain risks and limitation, but that was also what was happening in the spring. And also like venturi valves that are like you're using just for the one patient, so you can 3D print those. Then of course, if we a little bit look outside of this, so the other possibilities, so maybe not only for spare parts for hospitals, but also for the factories, maybe like water work. So keep up the things and infrastructure running, so we can get heat and water and so on. And of course, we could increase the local manufacturing, and then it wouldn't be so dependent about these global supply chains, which were broken in the spring and actually are still a little bit like broken. But also the 3D printing gives the innovation potential. So basically you can optimize the geometry and the product with the 3D printing. And because in the next print you can use the different geometry, you can continuously improve what you are making.
So, Mika, just a couple of minutes ago, you barely touched the surface about risks associated with 3D printing. I would really like to dive into this particular element as well, because countries, including the UK, have regulatory and legislative frameworks governing product safety and the liability for defective products to ensure only safe products are brought into their respective markets. So what guidance or standards should be adhered to when dealing with the safety of 3D printed products, especially in the case of medical equipment?
Yeah, basically, if you look about the standards, there is some AM related or additive manufacturing 3D printing related standards, but they are just more a little bit in the developing phase. And then there is some more new standards coming every year. So that's a developing. But for like if it's a medical application, there is the certain standards for the medical devices, example, and then there is you need follow the regulation of that country. So there is and even those standards for the medical devices, they were opened to free access during the spring to people try to innovate something. So the standardization organization opened those, so you don't need to pay to get the standards. And then, of course, there is this. If there is no time, so that's maybe one problem. What was in the spring, and that means that it might that we need to take some risk, but we need to be able to control those. So usually this government and regulation organization and those, they want to hide a little bit behind the normal protocols, because it's much easier for them. You just say follow the normal regulation, and that is, and don't try to solve the problem. So right. Basically there is a need for a cooperation. So companies, government, universities, so on, because we are in the same boat. And together we can really speed up the regulations and keep the product safety, but not waiting so long. And basically, if there is some kind of problem, basically the solution might be much closer than you think. So basically, if you share what is the problem and open your eyes, there is a different solution. And 3D printing is not the only solution for everything. And of course, if there is a time, so then I recommend it to follow the normal regulation and standards. And also, if you think about 3D printing at home, I don't recommend it to make any safety related products, because they might break. So right. Actually, you need to do what you are printing and how the material and everything behaves.
Right.
And as I said, of course, the 3D printing is not the magic bullet for everything, but it can help in many situations.
Right. And I think it's fair to say that the 3D printing concept is not something that took off just after the pandemic. I think it was gaining momentum even before the pandemic. And so that's very interesting, the wealth of information and knowledge that you shared with us. I thank you very much, Mika, for joining us. I invite you to stay with us until the end of the webinar for Q&A. But as I understand, you have previously organized engagement. So returning to you, Professor Pepe, I would like to address the future and what future would look like post-pandemic. Pepe, are you with us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Yes, great. Yes. So, Pepe, I would like to ask probably the most important question. How do you see companies planning for operations now and the foreseeable future? If not now, but at least the foreseeable future. How do you see them being better organized and having a better strategy in place?
No, there are you can take this question, of course, that's a critical question. You can take it from different points of view. One thing that is important to stress is that this pandemic and this shock hits the world economy when already certain important changes were taking place. Nicola was discussing in a very effective way what Industry 4.0 means for the economy from a more, say, technological perspective, the important changes that they're bringing, the digitalization of the economy, but also all the different technology like 3D printing and the way in which we interact with the machine. Now, of course, all of these, and as Nicola was saying, we are calling this smart manufacturing, we're calling this Industry 4.0, because it's changing the way the firms manufacture products. Now, if you have this kind of technology ahead, of course, this will have an impact on the decision that you take on the reorganization on international value chains, for example. And in fact, well before the pandemic hit the global economy, what we've been observing is that we have been observing a certain tendency to reshoring certain activities. Why? Because one of the critical decisions at headquarters states, what we've been having in since the mid-90s, the diffusion of global value chains after Montevideo trade round, was the fact that big firms were kind of outsourcing activity which were very low in terms of value addition at the bottom of the chain, so to speak, into countries where the cost of labor were very low. Okay, just because that was economically convenient. That was part of the story of global value chain. Now, when automation is kicking in, manufacturing products is becoming much less expensive. So the advantage of outsourcing certain line of production to Asia or to Africa to exploit cost advantage is no more there. It's not always there. So you were observing already a certain tendency to reshore certain kind of activities, or in other cases to nearshore that, so to put them in locations which are not that far from the headquarters. What the pandemic added to that is that now this is kind of becoming even more important, because the longer the chain are, and for what I was discussing before, in a sense, the longer the chain are, and the more distributed are across country, the less resilient, the more fragile they are to shock like this one, because of course it's very easy and immediate to think of. If I'm operating in many countries, now the risk of being hit by lockdown, it's higher, because maybe the epicenter of the pandemic is not where the headquarters are, but where the labor is taking place, where other part of the chain are taking place. So of course, shortening the value chain and reshoring some activity is giving now an additional advantage to me. It's now possible because of automation and labor costs are not that important. And now this is giving an additional advantage to me, because it's making me more resilient and somehow it's giving me some degree of insurance. It allows me to hedge better against potential shock, like in this case, a medical shock. Tomorrow it can be a climatic shock or a political shock for the same account. So that, in a sense, the pandemic was reinforcing this mechanism. This is a force which is pushing towards observing in the future even more shortening of the value chains, even more reshoring. Now, this is one thing, but this does not mean that we'll go to the full Monty story, because there are still important reasons why it's still important to keep some operation abroad, especially when I think to emerging markets. The demand from this market is increasing, especially for some mid-range durable goods, like, for example, cars or televisions and so on and so forth. So in some cases, it can be convenient to keep the operation there, because I want to operate close to the final market in which the product will be sold. Or in other cases, I can be constrained by the quality and the skills of the labor force in my country to operate a certain number of machines. So of course, there is a tendency towards shortening of the value chain. This has been stressed and accelerated by the pandemic, but I don't think we will hit anytime soon. We will go to anytime soon to a complete shortening of those chains. How firm we react on the other end will also depend on the policy that will be implemented. Sure. So part of this story, and again, I was hinting to this in a sense in my previous answer, part of the story is what will be done. The value chains were born, in a sense, from a legal point of view with the creation of the WTO and with Montevideo trade round. Once we move from trade per se to many much things together with trade, intellectual property rights, TRIPS agreement, on the way we manage the investment, and so on and so forth. This allowed to create this chain across different countries, keeping basically all the power at the big part of the control of the chain, and therefore the rents coming from the market in the headquarters. Whether this model will be viable and economically convenient for the firms will also depend on what is going to happen at WTO, which now is in a stalemate. Now the new DG will be appointed, and I don't know whether he will be able to revive the WTO and which direction we will be moving. In my opinion, and in our opinion, the work we are doing moving this direction, we should move much more in a developmental direction and find an equilibrium between maximizing the production, increasing the production, and distributing along the value chain the benefit of those production. Because another of the impact of the industry 4.0, again, all good things can go and with bad things, is increasing even more the differences between the share of the value accruing to the top activity, to activities on the top of the chain, this mining curve, which are at the beginning, at the end of the chain, or the design of the product, or the marketing and distribution of the product, and much less to the bottom of the chain. So again, technology matter, but the political choice about, and in this case, what kind of regulatory framework we'll have. And I sincerely hope that we will learn from the error of our past.
Thank you, Professor. That's very insightful. We are running out of time, and I would like to take this opportunity to very quickly address some questions that we have been receiving from our participants. I'm now going to invite all our panelists to share the screen, and we'll start directing the questions, except for Mika, who will not be with us for the Q&A section. So, Nicola, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a question regarding frontier technologies such as artificial intelligence and big data. The question is, can these frontier technologies contribute to the prediction, diagnosis, and containment of outbreaks better and faster? Nicola, perhaps you would like to address this?
Yes, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, sure. Do you see frontier technologies such as artificial intelligence and big data contribute to the prediction, diagnosis, and containment of outbreaks, future outbreaks, better and faster?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And okay, my answer it's not a univocal answer. It could be yes, it could be not. From a technical point of view, the answer is yes, because that's the role of big data and artificial intelligence. They have to predict. So they are able to predict something. They are able to predict something in very small scale. But sometimes things that are very big, such as for example, the diagnosis of the pandemic itself, is too much bigger for the artificial intelligence. So the prediction, it's not the right verb, it's not the right noun to see the role of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, it will be able to make some diagnosis, okay, in the past, to prevent something that happened in the past, but it's not able to predict something, especially if it's something new. For example, something happened in the past, okay, so artificial intelligence can help to handle the fact that this thing that happened in the past will not happen in the future, but we know what happened in the past. In the case when we don't know what happened in the past, artificial intelligence, it's not able to predict something that never happened in the past. That's the key idea.
Okay, so if not for the prediction element, can we at least talk about perhaps a more improved containment of, for example, another pandemic?
Yes, this is possible. This is possible. Yes, in order to, for example, in very small tasks, okay, it will help. For example, the geolocalization and the prediction of people movement, or for example, building a statistical model to see what are the people, for example, that are willing, maybe this is not the right noun but term, but willing to have the COVID, or it is possible okay? But we need to it's not a big picture, okay? With smaller tasks, it is possible.
Okay, all right. So that's I think that should be a good enough answer. In 2009, another question. In 2009, as the swine flu swept the globe, we experienced similar shortages in test kits and protective equipment, including the N9 respiratory masks. How do you see perhaps this would be for you, Pepe. How do you see the manufacturers being better prepared for such kind of shortages in the future?
Yeah, it would be very prepared. This was the main aim of Industry 4.0. This is we call this customization in technical ways. If we see in the past, maybe for example, the example that you made, the customization was something that was introduced for manufacturing because there was the client that wanted more. Okay, I am the client and I want more and I want more and I want more now and really fast. Okay, so and now all of endeavors that concerning in that industry and manufacturing are moving towards this roadmap. Okay, I want to be the more flexible. Okay, I want to be very
Right.
flexible, and this flexibility before the pandemic was focused on a client, so on someone that was asking for something because it has a need, but it was the need of a client. Now this flexibility of manufacturing systems does not have to take account only of the client, so the need of people, but they have to take into account the need of the world, of
Right.
big communities. Okay.
Right.
So it
Pepe,
is possible.
Sorry, Pepe, can I ask you to address the same question? I'm more curious about what your thoughts are on the predict demand and forward buy or just-in-time information to assure maintenance of optimum stock levels, so avoid stock outs or predict surges in ordering. What is your take on that?
No, that's one of the big issues. In fact, what you're observing now is these enormous stocks that many companies are taking because you have demands which is a bit erratic. And I mentioned already this. One thing is the feasibility from a productive point of view, and that case I'm completely agree with what Nicola was suggesting. That is, I'm becoming more flexible. This is what customization. This is what all this technology are allowing me to do, is becoming more flexible. At the end of the day, shortening the value chain and ideally doing all the operation just in one location is making me more flexible, not less flexible. It's easier for me to adjust the production. But my question mark, because these are much more questions than answers, are it's one thing is productive feasibility, the other thing is economic convenience. Okay. And the point is, and we've been witnessing this during this pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, many firms, even having the capacity to adapt the production and to scale up the production, they didn't do that. Why? Because they didn't know how long the emergency would have taken. So that you don't know how long you will keep that level of demand. So whether it is worth or not to scale up your production, because getting back to what we call the steady state, to the equilibrium that was before the crisis, will be costly. And so the risk is huge. So unless the state step in, making some guarantees to the firm or producing it directly, it will be difficult. In some cases, when the level of uncertainty are that high. And of course, whatever happened in the past, and here as well, getting back to what Nicola was suggesting before, what happened in the past gives me information to have a better prediction and better forecast. But any shock is different per se, and as the COVID-19 was different from the previous coronavirus, also the next shock that will affect us will be different. So our prediction cannot be perfect in terms of, and then you have a lot of dimensional uncertainty, policy change, political leader change, and the kind of policy response to an emergency like this one we have been witnessing in these months is important. So these sort of discrepancy between feasibility and economic convenience is one aspect to take into account. The second one is the productive capacity, because I can be able to produce a certain numbers and scale up production up to a certain point, but I have some limits. This is what happened with vaccines, for example. This is the story of the vaccine market. You know, whenever the way in which UNICEF and the UNICEF supply side and WHO work when they have to provide vaccine is having contract with 2 or 3 different providers, because one is not enough, because you have risk in the production structure, because the production scale is too vast. And this is one of the problems that we're having now. Now, even if in a record time we are developing vaccine, testing it, shortening up the procedures of testing, then we don't know when we'll be able to have enough number of vaccine to create herd immunity, at least in a certain number of countries, because we have a problem of productive capacity. And this, of course, is a question which we cannot answer for all the manufacturing sector in the same way, because we are different from sectors to sectors. So we know that producing a car is very different from producing a microchip. So my guess is that in certain sector, it will be easier to rise up the production than in other one. And for certain medical equipments and medical supply, it will be easier to do so. I'm thinking to ventilator, which is pretty easy and light kind of manufacturing. In other, like medical products like vaccines, or if we will find ever some viral medicament, that will be much more difficult to do so at the scale that we need.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. And thank you, Nicola. I'm sorry, but at this stage, we are running out of time. We're going to have to leave it here, but we have a few other questions coming in related to 3D printing. So what I propose at this stage is that we will redirect these questions to our panelists, and we will communicate this in the form of a post-webinar article. I thank you very much once again for taking your precious time to join us, the 3 panelists, and also for our attendees who have joined us today. And thank you very much once again. And we'll be presenting all these insights in an article, and you can always rewatch this replay, watch the replay on YouTube, on MyScienceWork YouTube channel. So with that, we wrap today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.